How well do you navigate change? Are you open to it? What do you need to reduce any resistance that you might have? How do you support colleagues through that process? In our ever-evolving world of language teaching and learning, there are opportunities for change in our practice. But is it easy? In this episode, I speak with Tim Eagan and Mike Travers, who are teachers and administrators in Massachusetts. They share some actionable insights and suggestions for approaching, understanding, and eventually embracing change. So let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively? If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and thank you, as always, for taking the time out of your week to listen to a podcast about teaching. And not just teaching, but language teaching. Just one of those many things that makes you an incredible educator. So thank you so very much for doing that. Our topic today is about resistance to change. Now, when you think about change, is change easy for you? Do you have colleagues for whom it's easy? Is it not easy? Do you have some resistance to that, either yourself or your colleagues? So in our ever-changing world of language teaching, where there always seems to be new things and new trends and people are talking about new stuff, there's opportunity for change, but it's not always easy. So we are going to take on change. And not just that, but sometimes when there's resistance to change. And so to help us with this conversation today, we're going to be talking to two teachers who are actually colleagues in Wellesley, Massachusetts. And Tim Eagan is the department head of world language, and Mike Travers is a Spanish teacher in the high school, and he's also the leader of the curriculum. So they've had some experience, both personally and working with colleagues and others with this topic. And also, they are out there in the conference world and they're sharing this with lots of people as well. And Mike is actually the conference chair for the MAFLA conference, which is our state association here in Massachusetts this year, but always good shout out to the state associations. But they've also presented at ACTFL and NECTFL and at NADSFL, which is the National Association of District Supervisors for Language. So they're definitely out there getting stuff done and promoting change and dealing with resistance to change. So both Tim and Mike have been on the podcast before. Tim was talking about his department and how to navigate a proficiency-driven focused department. And Mike was on way at the beginning, and we talked about grammar and the PACE model. So both great episodes, great people to have back on. So Tim and Mike, welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Tim, let's start with you. Let's just kind of jump right in. Why are people or teachers resistant to change? So what are those common sources of resistance that we might be seeing or feeling among language teachers?
That's an important place to start. When people don't feel a sense of belonging in their department or in their school community, when they don't feel a connection to their colleagues or a connection to the work, that's really where I think the primary resistance to change comes. Additionally, people need to understand why change is important. And I think Mike would have a lot to add to this as well.
All right. So, Mike, why is change important?
Well, it's funny because change comes off as a scary word. I don't know why I always am tasked with the scary words. First grammar, now change, right? But I think for a lot of teachers, depending on your school district, depending on where you're coming from, there's a kind of a lack of trust where you don't trust that change is actually going to be what's best for you or actually what's best for kids. And part of that comes back to a history. A lot of us can think back to certain changes that didn't go well, certain changes that we've all had to go through, maybe weren't executed in the best way. So I feel that messaging and kind of, touching on the fact that, there was some stuff in your past, yes, it's not saying that what you're doing is wrong either. It's just saying, all right, we now know better. What can we do better?
When we think specifically about languages, the entire proficiency movement, understanding what is language proficiency, what does it look like in the classroom, how do we understand the implementation of it, that's a huge sea change that we saw across the profession. And we continue to see it really got its legs, 10, 15 years ago, and has continued to be a force across the country. And so that's an enormous change that was really hard for people who had been taught to teach language through a grammar orientation and taught to believe by college professors that students needed to understand explicit grammar rules in order to apply them competently. And so that was a really difficult place when you worked with teachers who had a lot of experience and were very competent and skilled and successful teachers in many ways to come in and say, let's think about doing this differently. Let's figure out why we need to do it differently.
As I've mentioned to you, the episode we had previously, when you had talked about sort of leading a proficiency-based department, and it's had a very strong listenership. And I think one of the reasons in there for that is people are looking for how to navigate that very change you're just talking about. And a lot of the insights you gave on there were, don't just tell them they have to do it. You have to give rationale and onboarding and all of that. And that was a lot of what you had shared throughout that episode. And I think that's why it was so effective and popular with listeners. So I'll make sure everyone that actually both of their episodes, Tim and Mike's episodes, are in the show notes, so you can go back and listen to those. But specifically because you just mentioned that, Tim, like I think that was the very reason why it was so well received.
That's good to hear. There's also another point I think worth making. It's this idea that's called institutional theory, and there's a great article in Educational Leadership from last year. The author's name is Adonias Lewis, and he talks about institutional theory, saying that schools are institutions, and institutions are designed to maximize their legitimacy, to provide stability. And because that's the nature of an institution, institutions resist change necessarily. And then he goes on to describe that schools are not only institutions, but they're also organizations. And organizations, he says, really have an opposite role from institutions. They're about maximizing productivity and performance. They're about growth and improvement. And organizations have to embrace change. And so you have this tension in schools that are both institutions and organizations.
Whenever I talk to you, Tim, I get this new little concept, and you put this word into my mind, and then I have to start look. So I'm going to do all this stuff now. Okay, institutional theory. I need to learn all about this now, right? Because success criteria, that's what you brought up last time, and it's been like the thing I've been focused on totally. So thank you for always bringing those concepts in, and you kind of give that little breadcrumb, that seed, and then we can run with it. So thank you. So I will be spending some time with institutional theory.
That's
so,
the best
Mike,
part of working with Tim. You
right.
always, every meeting you leave with a new concept. You leave with this new idea. It's the best.
So I'm going to stick with you here, Mike, and I'm going to ask you now to talk a little bit about some of those key challenges that teachers face when they are adapting specifically their teaching methods. What are some of those challenges?
So I think like one of the first challenges that's probably one of the hardest to overcome is that teaching is personal for so many of us. There's an emotional factor behind all of this, which also triggers the reaction we have to change, because I mean, a lot of us went into teaching because we had that sort of connection with the language. A lot of us, it was the connection with the grammar, and now we're asking kind of change that. So that's like a huge piece, and managing people's emotions is, I mean, that's a whole study in and of itself, right? Mm-hmm. But I think it's some of the smaller things, some things that, you know, department leaders or, you know, teacher leaders themselves can actually do. And one of the easiest but hardest things at the same time that they can do is provide resources. Thinking about that question of like, how do you expect me to actually do something if I don't even know what it looks like? I don't even know what it sounds like. I don't know what to expect out of this. So thinking about how many resources can you provide, and not just providing the resources, talking about them. So if you, for example, if you want your teachers to start doing more communicative tasks, don't just say go off and do tasks. Don't just go off and read this article. Let me show you some tasks. Let's embed some tasks into our PD that we're doing. Let's find ways that these can come alive. Let me give you blogs. There's so many different blogs out there that teachers can go to and see these things, because honestly, seeing is believing. The more that they can see these things and be able to envision, all right, I know that this is what's being done with a novice level classroom. I can picture this at an intermediate. Or, okay, this example is in German, but I teach Arabic. How can I make this work? The more that they can see, the closer they'll get to that. And I feel like that's a huge piece with it.
Right. And adapting to those new teaching methods in there. And it's the resources, but also the rationale behind it. So if I can just stick with you on this a little bit, Mike, in terms of here showing this. So where is that delicate balance of not getting too theoretical, but not just sort of presenting it as here's a best practice? And there are a lot of best practices out there that aren't really well sort of empirically researched. They're just what a lot of people do, so in terms of providing that guidance in terms of here's what it looks like, how do you balance, say specifically with your own colleagues, how do you balance like showing that this is actually effective, it's not just a best practice?
So it's funny, when I think of our department, and like it's a great group of people and every single one of them is different. And I can think of, and Tim's going to nod along to this too, like I can think of some people that if I handed them the research articles behind it, they would shake their heads at me. But I can think of other people that would love the research behind things, that want to kind of dig into that. So I think that when it comes to managing the change, you have to know who you're talking to. You have to know whether that person wants to dig into the, all the theory and all of those sorts of things, and whether or not they just need to see how it works on Monday morning. So figuring out who you're talking to helps a lot. Another technique that's worked well is if it's a new strategy, like let's say when we were just getting on board with everybody starting to do PACE lessons, people were really nervous about that co-construction piece, because that's the unscripted part where you don't know how the lesson's about to go. You don't know what kids are going to notice necessarily. So what I would do is I would invite teachers into my classroom and say, hey, I'm giving it a go. I'm doing a co-construction during this lesson. If you have off during one of these two blocks, like come on in, come see what it's like. Because the more that they could see it, and they could see it actually happening in the class, they realize, so wait, kids can deconstruct that. They can figure out what's going on in this, instead of just telling them, oh yeah, just trust me, it will work.
And you had mentioned earlier on that piece that has the trust in it, like trusting that it's coming from somewhere. So even those teachers that if you hand them the research article, they roll their eyes or they don't want to see it, they at least trust that you've read it and what you're talking about is based in that. They don't have to read it for themselves. But it goes back to that trust piece that you started with. And for some teachers, no, they don't want to read it, but they are comfortable knowing that you have, and that's why I'll listen. So that's a really big part of that. So Tim, I'm going to have you put your administrator hat on here a little bit for this next question. How can colleagues or school leaders, administrators such as yourself, support teachers through transitions and specifically support and help their concerns?
A framework that's helpful for me to understand what leaders need to do is the Kubler-Ross model that is actually based on cycle of grief, right? And stages of grief: shock, denial, frustration, depression, experimentation, acceptance, and then a new normal. When we're faced with a big change, all people move along this curve, right? We move along it maybe a little differently. It's not this necessarily completely linear process for everyone, but everybody moves in some way along this change curve. So we have to ask questions about what tools we have at our disposal as leaders, and what tools we can provide, what structures we can provide to teachers in developing an action plan, so that everybody can actually see that there's an action plan with an outcome. Just like when we talked about success criteria in that previous episode, you need to know what success looks like. You need to be able to describe it, and everybody needs to agree on those criteria. There's another model that I think, Mike, if you want to talk a little bit about the Noster model.
Yeah, the Noster model, that was, when I first experienced this, it was life-changing. Noster, Knoster, if you're going to Google it. So the Noster model came out, and it's actually it wasn't originally meant for talking about educational change, but it works beautifully. It's basically just, it gives you this sort of almost like a formula for a successful change. And what it does is it kind of breaks down 5 different elements that you would want to make sure you have in place as you go to make some kind of change. So those elements are, you have to have some sort of vision. You have to know where you're going, why you're going there. You have to check to make sure that the people you're working with, in this case teachers, that they have the skills necessary to make that change. I mean, that's a lot of work right there. And for us, what we learned when we were making curricular changes was not everybody has to have the same skills. We used to try really, really hard. We sat through department meetings and everybody had to learn how to write these things and everybody had to know how to do these things. But figuring out who on your team actually has the skills and how you can kind of tap that teacher leadership in that way. So vision plus skills plus incentives, which always sounds super counterintuitive, but incentives can just be time, like giving teachers the time to actually do these things. Resources, like I was talking about before, and then an action plan where it's saying, all right, we're going to make this change and here's how it's going to look. Here's the rollout of what that's going to look like. And what I like about the model too is it tells you what happens or what's likely to happen if you don't have all of these elements, so that you're likely to run into resistance at certain stages, that you're going to get false starts if you don't have an action plan, that you're going to have lots of anxiety if teachers don't have skills. And I think it's super interesting, and I've seen it play out successfully in certain situations and then unsuccessfully in others.
When Mike said to me, when Mike had become the leader of what we call our 4+1 team, which is our high school curriculum team, and we were talking about incentives, I said, give me your list. What are the top incentives that you think teachers want? And he said, time. And I really paused and I said, time, because I had never considered time as an incentive. And yet teachers really, when we created space and we gave people time, they were very grateful and they were very productive in writing curriculum.
Yeah, that time piece is so beneficial. When I do my coaching conversations, the coaching episodes with teachers, they 90% of the time answer their own questions and find their own solutions to the problems we're talking about, because we are taking 30 minutes to talk about their teaching. Uninterrupted 30 minutes where that's all they're focusing on. And so it's really just this question of finding the time. And when teachers have the time, they'll engage and invest more that way. So I'm going to stay with you, Mike, for the next question here as we move on. In every department, we're going to have those skeptics, right? We do our work. They've seen the examples. Can you share some strategies or approaches that you've seen or personally have had that have been effective in overcoming that kind of resistance and encouraging that buy-in from teachers for the change, and particularly those that are going to be skeptics?
What skeptics? Nobody's ever skeptical of change.
Not listening to this podcast.
No, never. One of the first things to kind of keep in mind is, no matter what, the person that's resistant to change, most of the time, it's not coming from a place of malice. The person is not intentionally trying to be difficult. The person is not trying to be resistant to change. They either don't understand something or it's making them nervous in some sort of way. And I think just remembering that at the core is important too. One of the strategies, I forget where I learned it from, but that's been really helpful for me is when I first started sort of advocating for certain things, certain different changes, I always found myself being the person that had to provide the information up front, and I was being bombarded with questions. So I tried to kind of flip things, especially when somebody's being resistant to change. How is it that we can make it so that I'm asking them the questions and they have to kind of, look at their own views, look at their own teaching? Kind of sounds like what you were talking about with the coaching. Mm-hmm. It's kind of holding the mirror back up to them. They have to constantly be answering the questions. And it's not that they're defending their point of view, but it's making them reflect more on that versus you talking about a change and then you constantly having to be like, well, the research says, let me answer your question about this. Let me answer your doubt that you had about this. I found that to be a really helpful strategy.
Yeah, because it's not putting them on the spot, right? It's giving them agency. That's what I was hearing in that description right there was agency. You want to add something? I see you nodding away at that, Tim. Do you want to say something about that agency piece?
Absolutely. Yes. Agency and shared leadership, or even I think a better term is collaborative leadership, is so essential. Rather than trying to get teachers to buy into my idea, getting them to generate their own ideas and their own products and gives them a lot more ownership of that idea. It's hard though. People are often want to be told what to do because that's the model that they're used to living in, being raised in, working in. And so saying to teachers, we're going to do this collaborative leadership is often in and of itself a change that people might resist. So that also takes time to nurture.
Going back now, Mike, to what you were talking about earlier with the Noster model, I believe you called it.
Yep.
And the very first part of that, what was the number one on that one?
Having a vision.
The vision, right? So that's what I was thinking as Tim was talking, is that if teachers are a part of the envisioning, then the change isn't being put on them that you have to change based on this, but they're actually part of that change-making agency process. So I'm starting to see all these connections the way you're talking there.
Yeah, it helps to understand the why instead of jumping right into the how and what you're going to do. There's that why piece behind it as well.
So, Tim, I'm going to come back to you and let's get in the trenches of practical steps. I think we've been talking about I have all these words written down of things I have to look up now, Noster and Cobbler-Ross and institutional theory and all these things. Thank you all. I have so much reading to do. But let's get into the trenches a little bit, Tim, and talk about being practical. What are these things we can start to do? So what practical steps can colleagues or school leaders, administrators, either of those, what are those practical steps that we can take to start implementing change in a way that will have that buy-in and agency?
You have to play the long game, which means you need both a long-term vision and a short-term vision. You can't just dive into it. You need to make sure that you as the leader know where you want to go, that people in the department share in the development of where you're going to go. You also do need some non-negotiables around moving forward and having some outcomes. And it's a delicate balance. So I think the first thing is to understand you need to go slow. You need to be really patient. You need to look to people's strengths, align their strengths with what you're asking them to do, right? So Mike talked about the Noster model and the skills, really understanding what people's skills are or asking them what their skills are or what their interests are is important. And providing them with a lot of background knowledge. So much like we think about teaching literacy, we know how important background knowledge is for kids to develop reading and other literacy skills. Background knowledge is important for teachers to develop the skills that they need to move forward.
Let's move on to some recommendations for those out there that are listening to this conversation. So I'll come back to you, Mike. Are there any specific recommendations on this topic that you would, recommend to teachers?
Right now, I'm actually reading a book. It's not necessarily on this topic, but they're touching on so much with it. I'm reading a book by Thomas Guskey, Engaging Parents and Families in Grading Reforms, because when we think about, trying to move towards standards-based grading and things like that, that's a minor shift, if you will. So there's lots to talk about in regards to that. And I've gone down the rabbit hole of Guskey's work and seeing all of the different stuff that he has on change. But I also think that getting out of the educational realm too, there's a lot about organizational management and organizational leadership that can be really helpful as you go to think about these things.
We mentioned this before, providing examples for people and giving people the space to try things on and the permission to fail. And if you happen to be in a role of an evaluator, which is part of my role, being able to write in a person's evaluation a positive experience. Hey, I saw you do this thing in the classroom. You're trying the PACE model. Here's what I really appreciated about you trying it on. It didn't work this time, and I really appreciate your vulnerability to try that in front of your supervisor with kids. And I want to make sure I put that down as a commendation, right? It's really important to give people not only the lip service of being able to be vulnerable and fail, but the actual lived experience of naming that failure as a value, right? We don't learn, we don't grow without failure.
that's going to be a change thing for some folks, right? In that
Yeah.
in itself, right? So how can our listeners be reaching out to you, two wonderful human beings, to continue these conversations? Mike, where are you hanging out on the internet or blogs or whatever?
So I'm still on Twitter, X, whatever we're calling it today. And so you can check me out there. And I also have my own blog. I've written a little bit about Nostra Model and things like that. I'm Diaries of a Mad Language Teacher on Weebly.
Mm-hmm. And I'll make sure those links are in the show notes. And you, Tim?
I'm also still on Twitter, or I have so much trouble calling it X, and I'm at TJEAG, TJEAG, and you can find me there.
But yeah, you're very active on Twitter, so we can definitely check you out there. So our last part is always our hearty advice for listeners to leave them with. And I want to sort of look at this from two sides. One is you yourself are resistant to change. And so what can we do with that? And then we'll look at if you're dealing with someone who's resistant to change. So Mike, let's start with you from that standpoint of I'm a little resistant, skeptical about this change. What's some advice you can give to me?
So if you're feeling that resistance and you know that it's like a physical reaction you have to the change, I mean, if you can get to the space of starting to ask yourself, where is this coming from? You're already doing half of the hard work right there. And if you can figure out why do you feel this way? And if you feel a certain way, start to do some research of your own. See if you can figure out, what is making you feel this way? Is there something to back up what you're feeling? And is there something else out there? Because I think it's easy to just keep doing the same things, and it's easy to be resistant to change, but it's hard, and it's a good hard work to look back and say, all right, maybe there is a piece of this that I can admit that I want to change. Because I think that the goal of being a teacher is you just keep growing, you just keep learning. And I think that honestly, I'm going to keep growing and learning until the day I retire. So I think if you have that mentality, it'll make things a little bit easier for you the next time you go into that conversation with the person trying to get you to change.
And then over to you, Tim. Now you're dealing with that resistant person. What's your advice there?
Baby steps and patience, a lot of patience. It's always got to be about the learning, not about the teaching. And when you can reframe the conversation that it's about student outcomes and not about you as a teacher or your teaching strategies, that can shift the conversation and make it a little bit less high stakes. It's always important, particularly again, if you have the role of an evaluator, you can go into a conversation and believe in your heart of hearts that you're approaching it from a coaching orientation, but it's not fair to expect the teacher who is being supervised and evaluated, and we know in some states your supervision and evaluation impacts your pay scale, right? It's not fair for that supervisor evaluator to expect that just because I feel like I'm trustworthy, that you as the teacher need to trust me. So giving them that space and approaching it from evidence and from that perspective of it's about the learner, it's about the learning, and it's not about you as a teacher is important.
Thank you very much for that, both of you, for your ending advice there. Mike being that introspective, like, why am I having this reaction? Like, take some time with yourself for that. And Tim, that learning over teaching. I mean, if we even look at so many evaluations and they're all about what the teacher's doing and they don't even have student outcomes on there. And it is an evaluation of the teaching and not the learning. And that's a huge mindset shift in itself. Thank you so much, Tim Eagan and Mike Travers, for all of your insights and for bringing this conversation to the light, because so many people are thinking about it, and now we can think about it in different ways with different insights. So thank you so much for your time and everything you brought to this conversation.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
What are your takeaways from that conversation with Tim Eagan and Mike Travers? Are you feeling a little more reassured about taking on change and supporting your colleagues as well? Be sure to check out the show notes to connect with Tim and Mike. You'll also see the link to sign up for Talking Points, my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. There are also links to get in touch with me if you would like to work together. We can do that in person in your school or remotely. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. Let's keep the conversation going on social media. Connect with me on X, aka Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WL Classroom. And for even more valuable resources, visit my website, WLClassroom.com, where you'll find over 300 blog posts about language teaching. So stay inspired, keep growing, and continue making a difference in your language classroom.